School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with the Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share, and share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on the Awakening Educator.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. My name is Megan Sweet, and I'm here with Susan Andrian and Dr. Rachelle Rogers-Ard. This is our third in the equity series that we've been talking about, and we'll have one more after this one. In this series, we've been talking with different people about their perspectives of going through our education system. We first met with a student, one of my old students, who was then a teacher. And, I was just curious about what her experience was of being an African-American girl and having a white teacher, and what her experience was then, and then how her understanding about education shifted when she became a teacher. And then last week we met with Leroy Gaines, who is a long-standing principal in Oakland Unified School District, is now an executive director of a teacher principal preparation program and running for school board. So we talked a lot about how he approached equity, and our conversation last week actually rested a lot on how he created equity around the LGBTQ plus identified students and staff at his school primarily. Using that as the vehicle to have a conversation around equity and promote equity in his school. And today we're with Dr. Rachelle Rogers-Ard. Rachelle is an educator and administrator with over 25 years of experience preparing adults to lead, manage, and improve organizational health using her own authentic leadership framework. And her work transforms teams, increases productivity, and aligns systems, and improves the ways in which vision, mission, and culture values unite in organizations. I've gotten to see this up front and personal, and Rachelle is incredibly talented in the way she works with others. What sets Rachelle apart, and as I said, I've experienced it myself, is that she designs, implements, and facilitates customized training sessions around teamwork, recruitment, retention, leadership, and overall organizational health, utilizing social emotional best practices as a lever for equitable change. Her current training is Leading Across Difference, Understanding the Roots of Anti-Blackness, Whiteness, and Racial Bias to Create Inclusive Leadership. And Rachelle believes that leaders must interrogate their own biases in order to shift policies, practices, and procedures to lead to inclusive spaces. She's also the upcoming author of a new book that I'll let her introduce and talk about, where she studied a lot more about leadership, and especially Black leadership in this country, I believe. So we'll have Rachelle share with that. And she's also the author of this lovely book, which are one of the authors in the book called Portraits of Anti-Racist Alternative Routes to Teaching in the United States. So Rachelle has spent a lot of time helping to bring teachers into the workforce, and ones that are going to promote more equitable settings for youth. So Rachelle, so excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Super excited to be here.
Yeah, so good.
What a bio. Like, there's so much important work packed into the experience you're bringing to our show today. I'm super excited to dig into some of the things that you've been doing now, but also what led you to this work, which I think is incredibly important, hearing people's stories.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe we start there actually. Because I kind of forget that you did this whole Teach Tomorrow in Oakland thing, because you're always doing so much stuff. But when I brought this book out, I was like, right, Rachelle spent a long time identifying and developing teachers in Oakland. Maybe you can even share, you can start with your own experience as a teacher, but also maybe your experience of identifying teachers to work in Oakland, and what drove that work.
Yeah, I think what I hear, I appreciate those accolades. What I hear is, wow, she's old. So I was like, wow, it just keeps going. So yeah, there's been a lot of different aspects, right, of the work.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think it all stems from I began as an educator at Castlemont High School
Mm.
eons ago, and was teaching. I was brought in to teach the Castellar Vocal Ensemble. Actually, I was minding my own business, having recently graduated undergrad, and the Castellars needed a director, and they brought me in, as a long-term sub. And I fell in love with being a teacher. At that time, I was working, I guess, like the swing shift, and so I could come in and do some work. And the joy of working with those students was infectious. And so I was like, I think I kind of might want to be a teacher. And so went back to school to do that, and actually ended up at Castlemont. The late Ellen Posey said, "You're not going to be able to keep a teaching job if all you do is teach music, because of course we don't have that type of funding." So
Mhm.
she just walked up to me and was like, and so this is before NCLB. All right. So she walks up and says, "You think you can teach English?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think I can. I'm a great writer." And so started teaching English. And from there, that's when I started to learn what a teacher could do. Right. And
Mm.
you talk about having a really young, inexperienced, I think the term is intern, right, where you're earning your teaching credential. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I had the ability to build relationships. And I was like 26. I was super young, and those young people thought they were 26. So that worked out well. And we began, partly because of not just my age, but also my background, similar racial background. And I grew up in Oakland, and so there was already that sense of belonging. And those students, it's hilarious. I like to joke that I have very few friends who are not my students, and I still interact with lots of those students today.
Mm.
So, in various different
Mm.
spaces. So, I think that began my understanding of the necessity of the diversification of the teaching workforce if we're going to reach, particularly our underserved children. I had no problems, very few problems with classroom management and all those things that we learn in our credential programs. I was like, I'm not experiencing that because
Mhm.
I really had the ability to connect. So I would say that's really what led me to my particular thought process around teaching.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think about how that, I mean, obviously things have changed a little bit about getting folks in the classroom, but not that much, because there are often times when we see educators who are like, wow, this person really understands how to connect with kids, really understands how to show up and how to be there. And how do we get them in the classroom so we can help teach English, right? Like, so that the way in which our systems are working, that when we find someone who we think can be good for our kids, how do we hold on to them? And so I wonder how we take that and systematize it, which I think is part of what your work has really been about. Is like, how do we make sure that high quality educators of color who look like kids, who know the kids, can be in the classrooms and in leadership positions in our district? And how do we get away from just the informal, like, oh, I see you, come go in that English class, to like, how do we make it, how do we recruit and support and and help grow that?
Yeah, I think, Susan, that was the entire essential question of 12 years of my life with the Teach Tomorrow in Oakland program, was that exact thing. How do we, right, source, grow, recruit, place, support, develop, and retain, particularly teachers who were local. So,
Mm-hmm.
Teach Tomorrow in Oakland was about the diversification, but we had really excellent white teachers who were from the neighborhood, who were committed to children, who had worked on some of their own racial pieces,
Mm-hmm.
who are still teaching today. The greatest legacy, right, is that I can name teachers who are in Oakland who are still teaching, who are part of the TTO program, or they were principals, or they've become principals, right? And
Mhm.
so when you look at that longevity, I can go back to very specific activities and supports that we intentionally did that allowed those educators to really flourish and grow. And when I see them as principals and APs, and some are still teaching, God bless them. It's like amazing to understand that that's what the work really requires when you're thinking about teachers. So did that for a long while. And it was really those teachers who pushed my thinking. So my own personal experience married with the teachers' personal experiences that got me thinking, right, how do we systematize this work, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So a couple of like real quick, there was an African American male who kept telling me the principal sends all the little African American boys to my classroom, and he had like a row of Black boys in his class, right? Just a
Mm.
row. And I started asking, like, why are they, why are they there? What are they supposed to be doing? What's happening with the teacher who sends them out?
Mhm.
And really thinking about how there was not even the expectation that the other teacher who was not African American was going to somehow increase her pedagogy so
Mm-hmm.
that she could
Mm.
figure out how to address this African male. It was like, send them to my partner over here, and to the extent where it was not fair to ask this one teacher to take on the additional responsibility of the 7 Black boys in the class that nobody else wanted to handle,
Mm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
this brings up several questions. What are we doing for teachers to make sure that they are not, I mean, when you can send a child out occasionally, of course, but this was repeated, like they might as well have been in the other person's class. So what are we doing to grow that teacher? Why do we feel like it's okay to ask the African American male teacher to take on this additional responsibility?
Mhm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
what types of supports is the principal putting in place, right?
Mhm.
Like
Right.
Mhm.
all of those pieces start to create the way that I start to think about leadership.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. I mean, there's a few pieces in there that are, to me, feel really, really salient, and actually came up in our first show. So our first show, we talked with the lovely, wonderful Crystal Gix, who was one of my students, and I was team teaching with Mateen at the time, so African American man, and we were in each other's classrooms all the time. So I wasn't the white teacher that was sending kids to his class, but what did happen between the two of us is he would check me. Like we would have conversations, like if and they were loving. They weren't like all just like checking me, but like we spent almost every lunchtime together. We talked about the kids, and in our conversations about the kids and our reflections, he would help to raise my awareness in places where maybe I was not seeing things, and I would with him as well. I mean, it did go back and forth, but we had this he very intentionally helped me to understand where my bias was showing up and how it's impacting the kids in a way that let me then own it and not have to have it be repeated, which I think often is missed and kind of in that story, like, well, we're just going to go house the kids over here and we're not going to deal with it. Like, instead of working with the white teacher that is removing all of her kids and saying like, well, maybe there's an issue here that we need to be working with, instead, putting on the African American male teacher to hold those kids, and also assuming that that's the right thing to do, which I think is another thing that isn't always the right thing to do. And it was a little bit of what came up for me with Leroy last week, because he's African American male like leader. I'm like, oh, he's going to want to talk about my own bias showing up still. Like, he's going to want to talk about race in schools and what it's like for him as a leader. And he didn't want to go there at all, because he was like, yeah, we need to learn to talk with each other. And his whole thing that we talked about last week was like, we need to learn how to talk with each other. But he realized that his blind spot, or maybe the blind spot within his school, was more around a different form of equity. So it wasn't necessarily about racial equity in his schools, around bias against LGBTQ folks. And so he had this ability to like pull back and see the equity issues that he was seeing more profoundly. And for me, as we were talking with him last week, I was like, right, gotta check myself again. I thought I knew what the conversation was going to be about or needed to be about, and it wasn't. So what you named there are these issues that we need to keep bringing forward and having conversations about instead of just like pushing away. The other thing that just rises to my attention, of course, is like, what's the story that the kids are telling themselves as they continually get sent out time and time again, and that the only person who can handle them is someone of color as well. Like that also like comes up as me as a concern, right? And how does that start to perpetuate lots of challenges? So I think so what would be your response to that? Like, what was your response then, or how did that shape the work that you did? I interrupted you because I'm so excited.
No, it's no problem. When you shared your experience team teaching with Mateen, it reminded me of Karen Teal and Jennifer Obadiah, who shared their experience a while ago when I was doing like a lot of pre-service work, just around the necessity of having folks of color to help inform white folks teaching. And I think that's one of the things that made it unique in TTO, that we had monthly cohort meetings with all of the teachers from 9 to 12, where they would come in and really look at problems of practice. But it was not an affinity, it was, cross-racial groups. And so the conversation could get deep where others could, we could hold them accountable, but also we could sort of push them on their thinking. And I just heard from one of those educators 2 days ago who was like, that was incredibly impactful for her as a white educator to understand and also to have that support and create that loving environment, but also to start really asking those questions. So absolutely having support for teachers, but also like it really led me to think about leadership, right? And so it was through this, I did my doc in leadership, but I started to see that everything becomes around how we lead, right? And so for principals, what message, right? I want principals who's asking that same question. What message am I sending to these Black boys if they know that these white teachers can't handle me, right? What message is it also sending, though, contextually, right? In that that Black boys are sent away, right? And so we know with the school to prison pipeline that this away situation is part of the way that we deal with Black boys and then deal with Black men, right? And then what are we sending, what message is being sent from the principal to the teacher, right? To the white teacher, like, you don't have to deal with that. Let me take that off of you. This is clearly too hard for you. And then what message is being sent to this Black man, right? You must always stand up and do more and take more and take more and take more, right? It's a lot of that. And it all ended up being around leadership for me. And so I made a very intentional pivot when the funding for TTO was running out. I had a choice to either, I'm reminded that Oakland is still around, so I'm gonna keep this together, but I had a choice to work for the crazy white woman or the crazy Black woman. That's just what it was. And so I chose the crazy Black woman. And through that, I was able to really start looking at organizational development, which for me is just leadership development. And so I made a clear pivot to that from the work that I had done with TTO. And so that's where I am. I'm still at leadership development and trying to, and doing work around an anti-racist lens, which is what led to the book. So that was my long-winded way of answering that first question.
Well, I think it's with all of this, right? We're peeling an onion and we're sort of getting to the roots of things and trying to figure out how they're all connected, and sort of our perception of ourselves, our perception of the folks that we're interacting with, whether they're children or parents or leaders. And in my work and the behavioral health side of things, right, on the social emotional side of things and thinking about discipline and disproportionality. And a lot of our work in behavioral health has been to try and address the disproportionality through restorative justice, through trauma-informed practices, through like having the adults in the system really understand what they're doing to perpetuate these systems of inequality, and what's our work to do. But the thing that's come up through all of our work in restorative justice and all the trauma-informed and putting into place coordination of services and putting into place multi-tiered systems of support, we've really reduced the overall number of suspensions and expulsions and lost class time, but we have not even touched on disproportionality. So although across the board numbers are down, but we have not been able to address what we know is caused by bias and racism in the system, and how we as adults in the system perpetuate it just in the way that you were talking about. So I'm glad that it's now becoming a little bit more to the surface, that we're talking about the way in which we as adults have a responsibility to understand our role in white supremacy within the education system, because I think we're probably one of it's where it lives for a lot of people. Their experiences around white supremacy is lived through their educational experience, and we have a responsibility to shift that.
Yeah.
So I know it's not a question, but I'd love to hear what you think about to turn it into a question. When we think about like all of these interventions, how do we start to get to the disproportionality aspect of what's happening in our education system?
Yeah, I believe the basis is to understand racism in this country. And so as I love this notion of peeling the onion, right? And so if we were to get to the very core, the very root, what we have is, what is racism and where did it come from? Mm-hmm. And understanding that so that we can put the pieces in its where it belongs. So for my colleague, Chris Chapman always talks about healing the fish and this toxic ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. And so for me, if I'm going to inoculate African-American boys so that they can be healed, and I'm going to deal with systems, I need to be able to get all the way to the bottom. And the foundation is white supremacy, whiteness, and race. So if we look at that and understand, like if we understand where whiteness came from and how it started as a result of Bacon's Rebellion, and if we understand that anti-Blackness is the way in which all of these systems follow each other, then we might be able to better understand and thereby better heal from the toxicness that we're all ingesting, right? Mm-hmm. So when they talk about the systems of water exchange that we've all read that article, it's really interesting because we have to almost be able to part the water like Moses and go, oh, wow, we're swimming in this racist environment, and understanding and getting to where it is. So for me, it's about training our teachers and our leaders. It's mm-hmm. about understanding the system in which we are working. It's about.
Sorry, Rachelle. Yeah. I mean, I feel like the idea of water, or like this, like that it's like at a root, is such a powerful thing for it, to like way of thinking about it, because it's so pervasive, and we've all been swimming in it. So I think part of it is like, right, white people are certainly responsible for white supremacist culture, but we all are so used to it that we don't always even see it ourselves. Mm-hmm. Even if we're not white people, and we don't even realize the elements of white supremacist culture that are influencing the way we show up. So I talk a lot with my team, and they raise to my attention all the time these elements of white supremacist culture that we all fall victim to, like perfectionism and like, living in our heads a lot rather than connecting with our body. Like, so there's lots of, and that's a new area that's starting to develop of like, because what's even the awareness, like I'm sure that school leader had not even the awareness that was going on to the level that it needed to be addressed. And that's a typical story, right? Like mm-hmm. you told that story and I'm like, and that has happened, like all the time, right? And probably maybe he thought he was doing the kids a favor, like, okay, the kids aren't getting suspended, they're going to, it's someone who might understand them better, right? Like, so like unpacking all that's important. I know you've developed a framework, and I want to get to your book too, but you've developed a framework that I think, again, helps us to get to those conversations, because my experience is we need to have those conversations with care. And when we don't, what happens is that folks shut down. And I feel like I've had the range of conversations from, being called, pretty strong words, including racist and other things, where I'm like, wait, that's not me. And so hard for me to hear that I couldn't hear it. To the nurturing conversations I've had with Mateen or with you or with others, where I'm like, oh shoot, there it is again. All right, I thought I was on, like, I didn't see it that way, and the difference of what those conversations can be, and then the power of that. So I know that your framework includes some of that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the heart framework and how that shows up for you in your trainings.
Yeah. I do want to talk about the heart framework. I just want to sort of also back up just a step to the necessity of looking at all of those interventions that we continue to use from acknowledging a very white lens, and so sometimes we're like, we're trying these 9,000 interventions, and they may not work for everyone, particularly for African American people. Yeah. So that's just naming that, like where that comes from, and because it's not rooted in a lot of community, a lot of times the interventions themselves may not be as effective. Is sort of what I just want to circle back, because you asked me.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that. I know as a clinician, right, my work has shifted so much as a therapist from the individual and my relationship. When I started this work in schools, that's what I thought. I'm going to get assigned kids, and they're going to come to my office, and we're going to talk, and I'm going to heal them, and they're going to go back to school, right? Like the hubris that I had in that thinking of that way, and sort of my shift as a clinician to what's my role to help facilitate community healing and to get the student engaged in ways that they're going to be connected to the people that lifelong can hold that healing as a community healing through restorative justice or through other neurodevelopmental ideas. So I really appreciate you linking like there are so many of us in the helping profession on my end that we think we're showing up, there's savior complex, there's all of those things. And it is our work to check ourselves is what I think really helpful. So that I really appreciate you raising that up, because I think that's the constant work that we all have to do as educators and as intervention across.
So the SEL frame, and that's what led me to create this framework. Did a lot of work with the SEL team. Shout out to the Oakland Unified School District SEL team, Mary Hurley, Nina, and Sunny, who really helped to shift the way that I thought about SEL as not just being something for children, but really being able to see how adults embedded SEL, and how often we're less aware sometimes as adults, right? We're less aware of our affect, and how there's so many pieces within the SEL framework that could allow us to have those conversations, Megan, that you were speaking about. So in kind of an interesting way. So I was doing the SEL work, I was doing the organizational development work, and I kept coming back to leaders. Right, it just kept hitting me. And I had an experience with an African-American woman who was a leader, senior leader, and I just couldn't, her lack of self-awareness, right? But then I think for Black people, a lot of times we're like, we expect a certain behavior from white folks, but when that behavior comes from Black folks, some of us are like, I am always like, I didn't expect that happening, right? And so I had to wonder about this person. And in my reflection, I realized that I try and move from a place of authenticity at all times. I'm of a certain age where I don't have time to be faking it. And the mask that a lot of women and men of color wear through code switching or whatever, I am trying to meld those two together as much as I can, so that occasionally I might shift my language, but what you are seeing when you see me, hopefully, is the same person, whether I'm in Target or on this, on this call, or, whether I'm in front of a group of people. I need to be as close to authentic as I possibly can for my own healing, all right, so that I can move through the world the same way. And what I found as I talked to a lot of leaders, particularly leaders of color, they didn't find that they could do that, right? And when they did that, when they rarely were authentic, they were silenced, they were moved out, they were, put in increasingly difficult situations, or in situations where folks didn't want to be. And as I started talking to other people, I found this also happened for a lot of leaders, right? My study was focused on African American leaders, but I found this happening for women, right? I found that, probably not white men, but I found it for that this was very clear that there is this level of, I need to know everything as a leader. And if I don't know it, I'm gonna have to fake it, like big, and like, how can you possibly live through life like that, right? The second thing was, I'm sold out for children, but the system isn't supportive of that. And so I'm gonna be silenced when I'm at meetings. I'm not going to be able to speak up the way I want to be, because if I do that, I'm labeled angry or aggressive, right? So there's a lot of intersectionality there as Black women, or as women, like it's a lot of different pieces. And then finally, just this notion of being a site leader is really a middle manager situation, where the district level adults are asking one thing, and the things that are good for your children, like somehow for many of the leaders to whom I spoke, they weren't able to implement those policies, right? And so how do you become the authentic leader that you need to be if you're dealing with all this, right? And I would argue it's probably up, down, and sideways, right? And so the framework that I came up with is authentic leadership, the HEART model. And it was basically about honesty, and honesty from a place of, am I honest with myself, right? Versus, yo, I'm honest when I speak to people. Yes, yeah, that's fine. But how honest am I, with myself when I'm me in the mirror, right? Am I honest enough to provide honest feedback with people that's going to help them grow, versus the feedback that's going to make me feel better by letting them know that this is what I think about what they just did, right? And am I honest enough to say that this is not working, right? I think we labor in education like, oh, it's bad, but I'm great because I'm staying in it, and that's not healthy, right? So how honest are we? So that's the H. E is this notion of equity, but being able to use our empathetic tools so that we can have those conversations. I want to get to a point where, and I'm looking at racial equity. So I want to get to a point where I can have conversation with people across difference, because I'm using empathy, I'm using those SEL tools, I'm using mindfulness, but I'm still trying to get to this goal, right? Around how are we creating better systems particularly for folks of color. So that's the E. And then A is accountability. This notion of how are we accountable to others, to ourselves, and to our community, right? If you're not reaching back and making way for the next person, what are you creating, right? How are you accountable to others? Meaning you're modeling what accountability looks like, and you're holding others accountable because they can hold you accountable, right? So that piece, so honesty, equity, accountability. The R in the model is reflection. Are we intentional about our reflection, or do we just reflect when we're pissed, right? Like, I have started to create this, I live near the water. So, and I'm a water sign. So my reflection is very intentional. Um, I used to say I need to sit on a rock before I can figure out what I'm doing in life. And really, it's about being next to water and being able to say to myself, are the moves that I'm making, how am I moving through life? How am I moving in my integrity? Like all of those things that allow me to be authentic, I have to be intentional. So H is for honesty, equity, accountability, reflection, and then the final piece is trust. And trust was hard, right? When I spoke to African American men, they were like, trust could get me killed. So I can't trust. So then we had to start looking at what does it mean to have trust across difference, but also what does it mean to trust my gut? I knew that I should be doing something else and doing the work that I'm doing like 3 years ago. And I just ignored it, right? How do I trust those relationships? And how am I demonstrating being trustworthy? So am I impeccable with my word, or am I just saying anything and doing something else, right? And so that's the model. And when I teach it to leaders, I'm really asking leaders to ask themselves, how can you be better?
I love everything about that model. And there's so much that resonates with me. It's not just
it resonates with the 3R. I mean, the 3Is too. It's there's definitely some parallels in your both of your work in terms of insight, intellect, and intuition, and being able to trust. And so it's not surprising you guys connect but that is the work, right? It's also, and as a clinician, as a trained clinician, that's good work too. Like how are we feeling in our body? How are we connecting? And so I like that it's connected to the 3Is, and it really resonates for me as well.
Yeah. Well,
intuition is amazing.
Yes.
I don't want anyone to say that I, was reading that when I made it, but it really had a great
You weren't.
I think as leaders, we know what to do. We have that intuition, but we allow these outside influences to often shift.
Yeah, there's an incredible amount of pressure. And I mean, I think that's really where the intuition thing came from me in the book. I mean, I think as a human, I struggle with that, right? Of like, I get so stuck in my head and it's fearful because, there's like a lot of fear sometimes in following your intuition. But what I saw over and over again with school leaders of every background was this like doubting themselves and like stuck on a hamster wheel of like, I know what to do, but I'm being pressured to do something else. And then it becomes frozen. And either replicating the same habits because that's what's safe, or breaking the rules and risking your name, your reputation, especially if you're not a white male, especially higher up in leadership you get, the more dangerous that can feel and become. And I certainly have experienced that myself, right? Of like, oh shoot, like I'm speaking something against, speaking truth to power, however you want to name that, can be really hard. But I feel like the trust thing is such a key element of this work, right? And you named something that I'm wondering if you can speak to more, and you do it in your when you facilitate, you build trust. But I think it's the thing that we tend to skip the most, maybe because it's the hardest, maybe because it feels like not as important. But I've seen many attempts, and I've been guilty of it myself, of like having to have conversations about race and culture, or having conversations about school transformation, and generally race and like inequities come up pretty quickly whenever we're talking about school transformation because it's such a prevalent issue in our country. But we don't do the building of the trust. Like we want to get to the outcome without building the trust, and then what happens is things blow up, right? Because emotions get triggered. People have their own trauma and their own lived experience that shows up in the room. So how do you build trust, and how do you know when trust is, I don't know if you've done any work or thinking around, how do you know when trust is there so that we can go deeper?
Yeah, trust is the hardest one. And as a person who has had a couple of failed marriages over here, I can tell you that, right, trust is friggin' difficult. It just is. So when you're in workspaces, though, the intentionality of, first of all, naming, I want to build a trustworthy environment with my team. Like,
Mm.
I want to build some things that allow us to say this is gonna work. And I think what happens is, particularly in urban environments, when people leave, it's really hard to start again, right? So you have a
Mm-hmm.
team, you're intentional, you're like, we're going to build trust, we're going to do the foundational work. And the leader leaves and somebody else leaves, and here come new people, right? And so, where I had to look at two elements, the first is holding myself in a place of being trustworthy,
Mm.
that I'm not really worried about. Like, I had to stop being worried about how do I feel about this person. I'm moving in my integrity. I'm going to be trustworthy. I'm going to model it. I'm going to show you what it looks like. I guess that's the same thing as modeling. I'm going to come to my meetings and my people with this sense. I may get hurt, and that's where that fear comes. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be too trustful because I don't want to be vulnerable. But in order for me to do the work, I have to come in my whole full self.
Mhm.
And other people can't always handle that.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
have to know and be okay with the fact that I'm not at work to make my best friends. Like, it's all the stuff we learned when we were really, really young. At least I learned. My mother was like, "You're not going to school to make friends. You're going to school to do the work." Well, it's very true as a leader, as an adult. I hope people are cool with it, but because it's threatening to be your full, intentional, beautiful, wonderful self and to move in integrity, folks may have a time with it. So the first thing for me was I got to be okay here, and I can't really worry that much about that if I'm moving from a place of love and care,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And then people start to be drawn to that, is what I found, right? And so people who want to move like that are drawn to that, and people who don't are, repelled by it. And so I began to create groups of folks with whom I can be trusting.
Mm.
And it's surprising how, like, just happens naturally, that people are drawn to the light.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's interesting because I've been the last year or two. I've really been focusing on the physiology of relationship and the physiology of trauma and protection versus connection and how our body's responding in those spaces with neuroception, which is kind of your gut. What we're talking about, all that like pre-cognitive ways in which we're taking in all of the energy information in the room and all the small things to determine, do I feel safe or do I not feel safe, and how does my physiology respond. And then we have that feedback loop in our physiology. If you feel unsafe, you're looking for the danger, which reinforces the physiology. And so in this training in restorative justice we were doing a couple of weeks ago, David Houston was talking about how the first half of the restorative process, when you're doing harm circles, is completely on the relationship. But like, we don't even go to the harm. Most of the time is actually spent creating that trust and safety to be able to untangle where we were hurt. But if we don't do that work, our physiology is actually set up to protect us. And through all of our lived experiences, right, they're like, this isn't safe, you're going to get hurt, and so put your guard up. So we have to undo that physiology, which is really Resma Menenkin's work on My Grandmother's Hands really talks about the racialized trauma and the way our nervous systems are interacting. So it sounds like what you're doing is, with you using your nervous system, being like working, you've created this practice for yourself to regulate your nervous system in an open-hearted space that then lets other people's nervous system say, oh, okay, this is safe because she's safe, I'm interacting. And so you create that energy, which allows the work to go forward. Does that
I wish I was saying that. I think what I'm saying in this part, yes, I move in this space that is, so first I need to know who I am, right? So I've done the work,
Mhm.
right? I know who I am, I know what I'm saying, and I know I'm moving from a place, there's only two emotions, right? Love and fear. And so if I'm moving from love, then I am good with how I'm moving through the world. Everyone can't handle that,
Mhm.
and I'm okay with it. So
Mhm.
I wish I could say, oh, and as soon as I walk in, everyone is like, yes, I am, you are modeling, and I am with that modeling. No. What's happening is those who are okay with it, and it's very few, are like, wow, this is different. I'm
Mm.
experiencing leadership differently with this person. I'm that, my what I'm giving off in my body reacts to something in their body, and there
Mhm.
starts to build, and then that's when trust is built. Everyone is not with that. And as a spiritual person, I could definitely get into why that happens in the spiritual realm. But I'll just say that when I am building that, there are times when there are people who are greatly scared of it. It's
Mhm.
too real.
Mhm.
Wow, she just said, something that you probably shouldn't say because what'll happen if that gets out. This is my truth, and I'm speaking that, and whether it's to
Mhm.
power or to others, and that's not comfortable for people. So yeah, I
Mhm.
wish I could say.
Yeah. Well, but what you just said, I feel feels important to call out, which is I
Mhm.
do think I think you are unconsciously, at least for some people, I know for me, like, you're one of those people, like I truly feel like a magnet drawn to you, and I have to hold
Mhm.
myself back from like giving you a hug every time. Like I just want to be as close as I humanly can to Rachelle. And I've been stalking you now for almost 20 years. So it's real. Um, but one thing I think that your name that you do is you're doing your self work. You're checking yourself and you're introspective, and
Mhm.
you have a practice for that. That came up with Leroy last week as well. So as we're talking about equity, like he framed it around this othering, which I think is similar to what's happening with you, right? Like anytime you like create a separation from someone, whatever it is, you're othering. So when you're in your room, you're in a space and you're yourself, and the people that are pushing away, they're othering you. Why they're othering you could be a lot of different reasons, right?
Absolutely.
Um, and probably some of them are, they land on any possible thing that has to do with the person that's doing the othering. And what he named, and it's what I believe too, and I know you believe it too, is you have to do the self work. You have to know yourself. You have to know what you're thinking. You have to know what's real so that you can stand in that. Because I'd say probably it's just intimidating because a lot of people don't do, they can't bear to see themselves or see their full selves. And so when you see somebody who is willing to do that, it can feel really overwhelming because it's hard to
Mhm.
do. So I just want to say, like, I think it's all of those things. In your book that you just wrote, so you're saying the heart model came out of your interviews for the book, or what are some of your big ahas that felt important? I want to make sure we hear about the book, hear the title a couple times, how to buy the
Mhm.
book, because we have 8 more minutes, but also like what are some of, like, maybe it's even like one salient story or anecdote that came out from you in your experience of writing the book that feels important as we're thinking about equity and leadership.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to name that it is continuous. I'm being okay, so it is continuous hard work.
Yes.
So I just want to
Mhm.
throw that in. Being really thoughtful. That's that reflection piece. Am I
Mm-hmm.
moving
Mhm.
really from my integrity? Or am I moving from a get back, and not wanting to
Mm-hmm.
do that? So yeah, that continual piece. Um, so I had a group of I taught um, at Cal State East Bay in the admin program. So I had a group of students there. I had some folks who were through the TTO program who were becoming principals. I had some other folks, and Chris, my writing partner, had some people, and all of my principals and APs and leaders were saying very similar things. We don't have anywhere where we can be real. We
Mhm.
feel silence at all of our schools, and there were different Bay Area districts, not just Oakland. Um,
Mhm.
and we just need some support. And they would all come to my office and be like, "Can we talk?" And I was like, "I'm going to need more space, right?" And so, um, I don't know, something happened, and we just said, let's just go to one of your schools on a Saturday and have breakfast. And we did that. And the more we did that, and they didn't want to leave. I was like, we'll just meet from 9 to 11. And the conversation was so real. We created a container for these African-American men and women to finally have a place where they could say what they were saying, like what they were saying, like their inner dialogue. And when they said it, other people were going, you know what? I've had that same dialogue. And so over 3 years, we met with them and we were like, someone's got to, you know, give your voice a chance to be heard. And so, yes, I did develop the model out of that work, but was so meaningful. My gosh, there's so many stories. The book is Black Educational Leadership, From Silencing to Authenticity, available on Amazon right now, comes out on October 9th. That's Black Educational Leadership, From Silencing to Authenticity.
We'll make sure to link it on our page too.
We will, yeah.
You know, because we're, you know, academics, the whole first chapter is super academic, and it provides our framework for the work, for the, you know, all the stuff that you have to include when you write an academic book. But once you get past that, chapters like 2 through 5 are just their voices. We literally used a narrative approach methodology and said, we came up with 4 or 5 themes and we were like, talk. And so what you will get to hear in this book is like if you were a fly on the wall of these educators, and I have to apologize to everyone who doesn't like cursing because these educators were cursing, and like I had to tell my mom, not sure you'll be able to read this one. But so much. So one of the main themes with this group is none of them wanted to become principals because they saw the principalship as being oppressive, right? They saw it, they didn't have great experiences with people who were principals. And so I was like, you've got to shift that narrative. You've got to be the different principal, just like the way that you move and your integrity has to be different. You've got to be that person. And then it was like, but when I try to be that person, these things come. And or as you said, Megan, you know, other people experience it a different way. So that was one concrete theme. Another concrete theme was this notion of not being seen. So it was like, they don't see us and they don't see our babies. And every single one of those educators were like, my babies, these are my babies, these are right. And the ownership of that was so, it was just so transformative for me, right? That it was not, oh, these other kids or those kids over there. They were like, these are my babies. I want them to be safe. I want them, right? And so they continued to refer to them as their babies. And I thought that was beautiful. And then the notion of what they were dealing with systemically, wow, right? And so they talked about going to the all principals meetings and what they couldn't say and what they shouldn't say. And, you know, and I was like, wow. So really what you get here is a chance to really hear these educator voices in a way that we don't usually hear voices. So I'm very, very proud of the work. I will say that I was going to use a story for one of them, but I'm going to use a recent story. So I have experienced a leader who's a leader of color who has a really hard time with the way in which I just show up. So when you said it's intimidating, right? And so I had to be reflective. What have I done? You know, how's my work been? Nothing wrong with my work, but really this person has a hard time with who I am because I name issues, and particularly issues around race. And that's uncomfortable, right? And so I had to decide, am I going to allow this to shift who I am? In other words, be silenced. Or am I going to try and seek ways that I can have those conversations that maybe, you know, maybe could push this leader? Well, the leader did not want to be pushed. And so I had to be okay. I experienced some really, really tough, about 4 very, very tough months with this leader before I finally said, maybe this is what I have to experience to push me to something else. And so the largest aha for the work is maybe you have to get in the work, do your best work, and then pull out of it for your own health,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe go back in it for something else. It is
Mm-hmm.
rarely sustainable for you to continue to push against all of these systems and think that your health will be okay.
I
And you
love
have
that you
to be
said
okay
that.
with that.
I spoke with someone earlier today who had this notion that feels so connected to that, Rachelle, which is, and I'm stealing, I won't say who all the names because it was a conversation I have permission to share. But the question was that this person was being asked to ask of themselves was like, are you in the right container to do this work? And you're right, because if you stay in the wrong container and you keep pushing against it, your health and your well-being, and so, but it's scary. It's scary to step outside that container,
Yeah.
and not know what's next. But that question of, is this the right container for me to be able to flourish as my authentic self, feels like there's this connection with the conversation I had earlier today.
I think so many of us in education have the work feels so important. The kids feel so important, and to walk away from the thing that you're giving like 120% from is feels like am I going to give up before it's actually like we're really going to make a difference, because I believe so heartedly, and then you get some wisdom when you step away and you're like, this was never going to work ever. Right. I mean, I remember once early in this work when I was working at this charter school, and I was sitting next to my husband, and I was just sobbing because I had to make a choice to leave this school, which was the school was a disaster. It wasn't serving anybody, but the vision was something I believed in, and I'm sobbing. And he's like, "What? You can't do this work?" And I was like, "But it's so great." He's like, "It's not great. You want it to be great, but it's not." You want it to be this thing that you think it's going to be, but it's not ever going to be that thing because of this, all of these things. And he named them all. And I left, and now with wisdom. And I think so many educators, right, believe so much in the kids and the families and community, and that knowledge of when am I in the wrong container? Because so many parts of the water are toxic that sometimes it's hard to know when this is even more toxic than like
Yeah, we don't want to be seen as giving up because
yeah.
so many have given up before us.
Right.
And we, again, listen, it's either love or fear. And so
Right.
we don't want to be the one that, as people walk out the door, well, I can't believe they're leaving. I'm going to stay because I need to stay because I need to stay. Right. And there is a sense, of wanting to do a great job and being able to be in it long enough to see some change. But when it is so totally toxic that your body is not responding well, when you're not able to give to your family, when forget work-life balance, there's just not even like there's no balance, right? Just in anything. And when you can't really get to the vision because everything else is clouding it, that's the time to have that reflection, right? And there is what we know, because we education is an industry that's mainly for women. We know that women like to feel like we can change him. Everything's back to a relationship with a man, right? Right. If I stay in it long enough, he'll really learn how to wash dishes, and then my life will be perfect. And then he washes a dish, and we're like, damn, I hate the way he washes those dishes, right? And so you have to be able to say, this isn't working for me, my body, and my health, right? And I am going to make a commitment to love myself enough that I need to make a move. I may still be in education, right, but I need to make a move. And that is the hardest thing for, particularly for the educators that I interviewed. And it was hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was so friggin' difficult for me. And I'm like, Megan told me something really, Megan, you don't even know if I don't even know if you remember saying this to me, but I was like, Megan, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working. You're like, you're bigger than that. And I was like, oh, like clutch pearls, what? And so, just you saying that. And I think sometimes we have to go to other people and say, I see you. And maybe you're bigger than that. Not from a place of pumping up an ego, but just that the vision that you have and the things you have to give to this world are larger than the way you're being silenced and put into the container. I want to work where the container is open. So
that's about the best way to end this possible. Work where the container is open. Your fears. So that's what that's about.
Totally fierce.
This was such an amazing conversation. I can't wait for people to read your book. Can you tell us one more time how to get that book, Rachelle?
Yes, you can go on Amazon for Black Educational Leadership. It is available October 9th, but you can pre-order so that it will be in your actual mailbox on the 9th and or maybe the 10th. You can order also on Rutledge.com. That's Rutledge.com, which is the publisher, but Amazon is easier.
Yep. Thank you so much, Rachelle. This was such a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Such an important conversation, and so great. It's so glad that you're writing a book that's specifically for Black leaders right now, because for all of us to be able to understand the position they're in, and we have so much work to do, and just the powerhouse that you are and the vision that you bring to the work, it excites me.
Well, thanks, Susan. I appreciate it. Thanks, Megan, for the invite. Really appreciate it. This was fun.
Thanks, Rachelle. Yeah, it was fun.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator.